Welcome back. Like I said, my name's Terry. I've been a meat cutter for over 40 years. So what I prepared for you today, as you can see, this is a chart that shows down all the cuts, and we'll get to that in a minute. um, one of the most questions, or one of the questions I get asked most often is, which steak is better? Do I want a prime? Do I want a choice? Do I want a select? Well, here's the kind of the breakdown of how that works. Prime is usually the most tender. The reason why prime is more tender, it has to do with the amount of fat that's actually on the inside of the muscle. These little bitty streaks inside the red part of the meat, that's what determines its tenderness. Um, so with that being said, prime is usually the best. It's usually more tender. Choice is the next level down. Choice will have not near the marbling inside the red meat as a prime. Um, to me, it's just as good. The flavor is just as good, but um, so the tenderness is pretty close to the same usually. Um, Now, the next grade below that you'll find in supermarkets is select. Select is really lean. Um, you won't see hardly any marbling inside the red part of the meat, inside the muscle. Um, However, it's because of the lower fat content. It can be a little better for you than the choice of the prime. Um, so, with that being said, the other thing that I want to cover is everyone says, "Oh, I want the Angus. I want the Angus. I want the Angus. It's got to be Angus." Okay, well here's the difference. People always say, "I want Angus because it's always more tender." Well, it depends on what grade the Angus is. Okay, the one thing that most people don't understand, Angus is a breed. It's a breed of cattle. It's not a grade of meat. Um, Now, the one thing I will say that the Beef Council has done, they have done a fantastic job of promoting Angus. Um, so, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get into this chart. Okay, so it's basically the way the cow breaks down, and this is a whole side. It's a rib, the chuck, the shank, the brisket, the plate, the flank, the loin, the sirloin, and the round. So, let's take the chuck 7-bone pot roast, which you do not see very often in a lot of supermarkets. Um, so what makes this a 7-bone? Okay, well there's not technically 7 bones in this roast. Okay, the reason why it's called a 7-bone roast is because this little bone here on the bottom is in the shape of a 7. That's what makes it a 7-bone roast. So the next thing is the boneless chuck pot roast, which is not a thing in the world but this little bottom section has been removed. So you see the chuck steak, the chuck eye steak, okay? So what makes a chuck steak versus a chuck roast? The only difference is the thickness of the cut. Most of your chuck roast cut 1.5 to 2 inches, depending on how heavy of a chuck roast you want. Chuck steak can be 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch, whatever you want. The only difference is in the thickness of the cut. Now the chuck eye steak, which I'm going to cover next, okay? The chuck eye steak, technically, the chuck eye steak comes right in here. It's right in between the ribeye and the chuck. So this is a very tender cut of meat when you can find them. A lot of places don't cut them. They'll take the chuck eye and it'll go into their ground chuck. It goes into their stew meat. A lot of places don't cut them. The top blade and the shoulder top blade. The only difference is here again is the thickness of the cut. Now this comes off of the bottom of the chuck, which is the shoulder. So here again you've got the shoulder pot roast, shoulder steak. No difference whatsoever. Now the shoulder center cut, which comes out of the middle of this, is often called a ranch steak. There's really not much difference between the center and here, except for this little piece right in here. That's the only difference. This is called a shoulder petite tender or a chuck tender, whichever one you want to however you want to call it. But the chuck, this actual chuck tender, the petite tender as it's marked on this chart, actually comes off the back side of this 7 bone right here. This little piece of meat right here. They're very tender. They're great in the oven. You can get them cut thin and even pan fry them if you like. They're pretty good. So it goes into here, you know, talking about the petite tenders. This is a petite tender roast. This is a petite tender steak or a chuck tender. Boneless short ribs is usually this little piece right here that comes off the bottom of the chuck. That's why you see a lot of them, a lot of stores. They'll cut them off of that. You can even use the petite tender and make a boneless short rib. It just depends on what you want. So next I'm going to cover the ribeye. Okay, so basically this piece of meat would be this entire rib bone right here. So when you break cattle, okay, you always break on the quarters. You always break on the 7th bone. Always. No matter what, you break on the 7th bone. So if you go, say you're having a big party or you're having a big gathering and you want an 8-bone ribeye roast, they don't exist. Occasionally you'll find one that's got 8 bones on it, but I can tell you that last steak on there is going to be so tough you can't eat it, no matter what you do to it. So there's no difference between a rib roast and a ribeye roast. Okay, a rib roast just has the bone on it. The ribeye roast is a boneless. There's no difference between a rib steak and a ribeye steak. The rib steak has a bone in it. The ribeye steak doesn't. It's no difference. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is the T-bone, or the loin, what they call it. Now, this chart does not show it, but on the front of this is actually the sirloin, okay, which is here, okay, and it does not show like, well, yes, it does. It shows top sirloin steak right here, all right, the tri-tip and the tri-tip steak, okay, so I apologize, it does show that. So basically, on the T-bone, you can get all these cuts off of a T-bone. So many people ask me, what's the difference between a porterhouse and a T-bone? Well, I'm going to show you. So technically, and I don't know if you can see it with my stick here, but there's a little muscle right in here on the top of this loin. That's called the porter muscle. That's the difference. That's what makes this a porterhouse and this a T-bone. Top loin steak or a New York strip, not a thing in the world except it's got the bone on it and the tenderloin has been removed. Top loin steak, this is a boneless one. It's no difference, just got the blade bone pulled off of it. Tenderloin roast, tenderloin steak, no difference. Just the difference in the thickness of the cut. Sirloin steak, the top sirloin steak, which has a tri-tip on it. Okay, so on the tri-tip is this little piece of muscle right here. This is just a sirloin. It's no different. The tri-tip does really good on a grill. California, it's huge. The top sirloin steak usually are pretty good. You have to kind of be careful when you select them. A lot of times the meat cutters are bad about, there's a little bit of thing right here called an oyster that they leave on it, which is what I refer to it. But this thing is nothing but gristle. So if it hasn't been removed, that part of it's going to be tough. So we're going down to the round. All right, so on a round steak, you're going to have a top round, a bottom round, and an eye round. If you cut it whole, you're going to have a top round on the top, an eye in the middle, and a bottom on the bottom. Pretty simple. The top round roast or top round steak is usually very, very lean. The bottom round roast, that's another question that I get asked a lot. What's the difference between a bottom round roast and a rump roast? Nothing. I'm here to tell you there is no difference between a bottom round roast and a rump roast. A lot of people can tell you what they want to, But I'm telling you right now, there's no difference between a rump roast and a bottom round roast. No difference whatsoever. A lot of people think that if it's a rump roast, it has a point on it. That's not entirely true. You cook a bottom round roast the same way you would cook a rump roast. Oops, sorry. So there's not any difference in them. They're exactly the same thing. Eye round roast, you can do them the same thing. The eye round steak, no different from the roast, except it's cut thinner. All right. So the sirloin tip. A lot of people like sirloin tip. Me personally, I like sirloin tip. Basically, a sirloin tip is on the other side of the bone of the round. So there's a lot of things that you can do with a sirloin tip. You can take a tip, you can make a roast, you can make a steak. They're calling this a center, but that's not entirely true. This is a sirloin tip center steak, which is not a thing in the world but the center muscle. This is the tip side, or the lean side as we refer to it. Now, what you can do with these, you can take these and slice them really thin and make what's known as a breakfast steak. They're very good. The shank meat comes down here off of the arm. The brisket, of course, comes right here. Comes right off the chest of the cow. A lot of people like brisket. I like brisket. They're great barbecued. The trick to cooking a brisket is cook it low and slow. A lot of people come in and they're like, "Oh, trim all the fat off of it." Okay, I'll trim it off, but it's going to be tough. The best way to cook a brisket for me is leave all the fat on it, cook the brisket, and then trim the fat that I don't want. A lot of times people get these confused, a skirt and a flank. They still are basically in the same place. One's just above the other, but skirt and flank are both great for like making fajitas. You can even use the flank for stir fry. So when you get ready to cut it for stir fry, cut it across this way, and it'll be a lot tender. Of course, ground beef, cube steak, stew meat, beef for kebabs, and beef for stir fry all come from somewhere, usually right around in here. You're not going to use the primal cuts to get stew meat, cube steak, kebabs, whatever. Now I do. I use the top sirloin steak to make my kebabs, and they always come out good. So that's the basic breakdown of cattle and basic breakdown on the cuts. Hope this helps you. If you enjoyed the video, please click subscribe. If you got any questions, I'll be glad to answer them as quick as I can. Thanks. Have a great day.